Have you ever stopped to think about what happens when time simply stops? Not by mistake, nor by chance, but by intention. When the hand freezes, the ticking stops, and suddenly, nothing moves. Not the clock, not anyone's heart. That night, death didn't come with screams. It came with precision. A man was murdered at the exact moment a century-old clock stopped working. Coincidence? I don't believe in coincidences, especially when time seems to have been manipulated like a weapon. What I found in that house wasn't just a lifeless body, it was a message hidden among gears, inheritances, and ancient secrets. Someone wanted to be heard, but not with words, with silence. And when silence speaks, I listen. Before we begin this investigation, answer me one thing. Where are you watching this video from? I want to know if I've been there before, or if I'll ever show up. I got the call in the middle of the night. The police chief's voice sounded different, as if something was out of character, even for someone dealing with the worst of humanity. It was 3:07 when I parked my car in front of the Ramirez mansion. The night air was heavy, almost still, as if the house itself knew what had happened. Upon entering, I was greeted not by sirens or shouting, but by a dense silence and a stopped clock on the wall. The clock hand read 2. Nothing seemed out of place, except the motionless body of Jonas Ramirez dressed in a suit and tie, slumped over the armchair as if he'd simply fallen asleep. Beside him, a full, inert glass of wine. More curious than the corpse itself was the fact that the clock had stopped at exactly that time. And what's more, no one could explain why. That house, it smelled of unresolved history. The kind of home where secrets hide behind heavy curtains and old photographs. Everything there screamed for answers, but in a whispered way, like a macabre invitation. The police officers were disconcerted, and not by the death itself. It was by the symbolism. Time, inside, seemed to have decided to stop of its own accord. It didn't take long for me to realize this case wasn't just a murder. There was something more, something purposeful, planned. And the detail that bothered me most was precisely what everyone was ignoring. When time stops at the exact second life ceases, it's a sign that someone is trying to tell us something without using words. The clock hanging on the wall wasn't just any old piece. It was a genuine Varden Sons, handmade in the late 19th century, brought from England by the victim's great-grandfather. It had endured wars, changes of government, house renovations, and yet it never stopped. According to the housekeeper, who had worked there for 32 years, not even on stormy nights did the old clock fail. This made the silence of its gears all the more unsettling. Curious, I carefully opened the glass lid and examined the interior. The gears were clean, well maintained, and nothing appeared to be broken. It was obvious someone had manually stopped it. But what intrigued me was a small detail on the dial, a circular scratch, as if the winding key had been recently forced. This was no accident. When I asked the family about the clock's operation, I noticed exchanged glances and vague answers. They said the town watchmaker was the one who maintained it, and that he had been there only a week before his death. His name, Herculano. I made a mental note. There was something about this clock that transcended time and mechanics. It wasn't there just to tell the time. It was there to mark the exact moment of some truth. It was as if someone wanted to freeze that moment to immortalize it. The murder happened at a precise symbolic time, a carefully rehearsed act, and I'd seen it before. The difference was that this time, the precision of the crime indicated that the perpetrator hadn't just planned the death. He'd wanted to send a message, and perhaps the clock was just the beginning of what was to come. Jonas Ramirez was no ordinary man, a renowned criminal lawyer, a collector of controversial cases and silent enemies. He defended confessed murderers, saved corrupt individuals from certain sentences, and made headlines more than once. His name was known in the courts, and feared behind the scenes. The kind of man who, with a smile on his face, buried reputations. But fame exacts its price, and in Jonas's case, it seemed to have exacted a price. Talking to former colleagues, I heard whispered, unspoken stories, blackmail, threats, backroom deals. A man who swam with sharks and didn't mind bleeding, as long as he was the last one to sink. Apparently, there was no shortage of contenders for the title of person with motive to kill him. Jonas was married to Helena, a cold, methodical woman, who accompanied him to events like a decorative piece, beautiful, silent, immobile. He also had a stepson, Caio, young, impetuous, with unresolved anger in his eyes, a boy who clearly didn't accept the role of foster son. The family was a disjointed jigsaw puzzle, held together by appearances, and perhaps by convenience. The more I got to know Jonas, the more I realized he was a man surrounded by walls, some made of laws, others of secret. And there in the armchair where he was found dead, with that untouched glass of wine and a stopped clock on the wall, a nagging thought occurred to me. What if Jonas already knew someone would come after him? What if that death was the final part of a game he himself started? The Ramirez mansion was the kind of place that commanded respect. An ancient building with stone columns, wrought iron gates, and tall windows that seemed to watch everyone pass by. Upon entering, you don't feel like you're in a house. You feel like you're invading a secret. The walls held more than paintings and period furniture. They held stories no one dared tell aloud. It was the perfect setting for a crime that demanded silence and precision. The hallways were long, the floor creaked beneath my feet, and the air inside was thick, as if time and dust had made a pact. Everything was impeccably clean, but lifeless. The main room, where Jonas was found, was wide and cold, even with the fireplace blazing. There was something about the space that dispelled any sense of comfort. The heavy curtains blocked the light, and the only silent witness to the crime was that damned hanging clock. I scanned the objects carefully. Marble statues, hardcover books, framed diplomas. Nothing seemed out of place, and that was precisely the problem. At crime scenes, what stands out isn't always what's missing. Sometimes, it's what's perfectly arranged. This orderliness bothered me. It was as if someone had cleaned up the scene, but left the most important mess: the lack of meaning. The mansion felt more like a theater. Every piece of furniture, every object, seemed positioned with intention, and I began to realize that this crime wasn't just about killing a man. It was about creating a narrative. The killer didn't just take Jonas's life, he put on a show, and as in every show, the setting spoke louder than the characters themselves. I returned to the clock. That quiet, seemingly harmless piece caught my attention more than Jonas's own body. It was as if he were silently shouting, "Look at me." I examined every detail again. There were no signs of breakage, no cracks, or dust on the mechanism. But there was something more subtle, the kind of thing only those who have seen time manipulated before noted. The back had a slight, circular scratch, as if someone had opened the case in a hurry, or too nervous to care about marks. And the curious thing, none of the residents even admitted to knowing how to work that clock. But I knew that stopping a Varden and Sons required precision, and a skill you can't learn by watching videos on the internet. This was the job of a technician, someone who understood not only gears, but symbolism. In the technical file, I discovered that the clock chimed every 15 minutes, with a distinctive bell. The last sound recorded by residents was at 2:30 a.m. After that, there was complete silence. This meant it stopped exactly 13 minutes later, the same minute that, according to the forensic experts, Jonas died. Nothing in a case like this is a coincidence. Nothing. I sensed the clock wasn't just a clue. It was the key. The killer used it as a signature, as a full stop, as if to say, this is where it all ended. But why? Why not just leave the body and run? Why touch time, manipulate the minutes? This wasn't just a murder. It was a message, and I needed to find out who it was written for. Jonas's body was positioned in a strangely elegant manner. He sat in the brown, leather chair, legs crossed, hands on the armrests, as if he'd simply dozed off after a long read. But the precise cut on his neck betrayed the truth. It was clean, deep, made with a sharp blade and a practiced hand. There was no blood spattered, just a thin line, running down the collar of his white shirt. The wine glass beside him was full, untouched, an expensive vintage, the kind you don't waste, unless someone wants to stage something. There wasn't a bottle in the room, nor another glass, just him and the glass. On the small table, a book lay open to page the same number as the minutes on the clock. Call it a coincidence. I call it a clue thrown with arrogance. The scene was too flawless to have been real. There were no signs of a struggle, no furniture out of place, nothing to indicate resistance, no strange fingerprints. The carpet was straight, unmarked, and even the fireplace burned calmly, as if someone had recently replaced the wood. It was as if the death had been an intimate and silent act, an end scripted down to the most minute detail. I analyzed the scene in layers, from the obvious to the invisible. A crime like this isn't committed impulsively. It's calculated, almost mathematical. Whoever did it planned every second, and left just enough to intrigue, but not to accuse. A crime too elegant to be a mistake. And that bothered me, because elegance, in this kind of scene, always hides something, or someone. As soon as I saw the doorknob, I realized something wasn't right. The room door was locked from the inside. A single, old key, the kind that turns with resistance, and makes a noise. According to the forensic team, it was in the inside pocket of Jonas's jacket, the kind of detail that turns a common murder into a classic mystery. A true locked room, any investigator's favorite nightmare. The living room windows were thick, with reinforced glass, and internal locks. None of them forced. None opened. No secret tunnels. No false passages in the walls. I checked them one by one, with the patience of someone who knows the killer was overconfident in his own deception. It was as if he were saying, no one came in, no one came out, and yet, there was Jonas dead. I questioned everyone present about the door. No one claimed to have opened it, nor heard any noise. Helena said she was sleeping. Kayo claimed to be listening to music with headphones. And the housekeeper swore the last time she saw her boss was around 10 o'clock at night. No one knew. No one saw. No one entered. And yet, the crime had happened. This told me something important. Either the killer was still in the house, or he never left. Cases like this aren't solved by luck. They require logic. They require the right questions. How did the key end up in Jonas's pocket? Did he put it there before he died, or after he died? Because if it was afterward, someone knew him well enough to touch his body without hesitation, and that narrows the list of suspects significantly, and takes the mystery to a new level. I started with the obvious, who was in the house that night. The first on the list was Helena, the wife, elegant, firm, with a look far too cold for a recent widow. When I mentioned the watch, she looked away for a split second. A small detail, but my job is to notice what others pretend to hide. She showed no pain, just a subtle discomfort, as if the death had disrupted something more important. Then came Kayo, the stepson, in his early 20s, rebellious, explosive, the kind who carries his anger around like an invisible. He said he didn't have a good relationship with Jonas, but he didn't seem shaken either. He looked at me as if challenging me to prove something. He had a history of bullying at school, and a recent report for contempt. It wouldn't be hard to imagine him going too far, if it weren't for the lock. The third piece of the puzzle was Dr. Luana, the family psychiatrist, called in to see Jonas after a nervous breakdown months earlier. Young, intelligent, evasive, the kind of woman who learned to measure every word. The housekeeper mentioned seeing her leaving the house the day before, but she denied it. And when I mentioned the possible change in Jonas's will, she paled. More than a professional, there was a personal connection there. And finally, Herculano, the watchmaker, the most unlikely, and for that very reason, the most interesting. He knew the house, the clock, and had been maintaining it for over 10 years. According to records, he'd been at the mansion a week earlier. A simple man, but with a sharp. When I mentioned that the clock stopped at 2:43, he simply smiled and said, "Old clocks have a mind of their own." That's when I understood. This crime wasn't about who, but about why. Interrogations are like chess. Every sentence is a move, and silence is sometimes worth more than a confession. I started with Helena. When I asked where she was at the time of the crime, she answered without hesitation, sleeping, like any normal person. But the sentence came too quickly, as if she had already rehearsed the answer. And when I mentioned the untouched wine, she bit her lip. Small gesture, big noise. With Kayo, it was different. He tried to appear disinterested, but his eyes betrayed more than he'd like. When I asked about the clock, he became irritated. He said it was just an old clunker, but then he blurted out, "That damn clock always messed with my sleep." A sentence that, in itself, undermined the earphone's alibi. No one notices the hourly chime if they're wearing earphones. With Dr. Luana, the game was more psychological. I mentioned the possible new will, and she smiled, But her eyes betrayed surprise. She denied any intimate involvement with Jonas, but hesitated when I asked if he feared her. That wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Her voice was low, as if she didn't want to awaken ghosts. And for the first time, she asked me a question in return. Do you believe we're all capable of murder, Mr. Spencer? I returned to Herculano, just to test a theory. I showed him a photo of the scratch on the clock. He said nothing. He just took a handkerchief from his pocket and calmly cleaned his glasses. Then he replied, if someone forced this, they didn't do it carefully. The phrase was too precise for a simple man, and as he left, I noticed he lightly touched the face of another clock in the house, as if greeting an old friend. That triggered a signal for me. Time there wasn't just context, it was an accomplice. The next morning, something new appeared. The nervous housekeeper called me into the music room. On the grand piano, carefully propped between the keys, was a note, yellowed paper, folded in half, with no envelope. The handwriting was firm, written in blue ink. Time stands still when truth is silent. A simple phrase, poetic, even, but it carried too much weight to ignore. The first thing I did was check for fingerprints. Nothing. No marks. No trace of recent handling. The paper was old, but the ink was fresh. In other words, whoever left the note did so recently and knew exactly what they were doing. It was a warning, a provocation, or perhaps one last piece in the game of a killer who didn't want to disappear, but to be understood. I showed the note to Helena. She looked at it, read it, and returned it without expression. Caio smiled, as if it were a bad joke. Luana read it twice, then excused herself, and left the room. And Herculano, he didn't need to read it. He just heard the sentence aloud, and murmured, beautiful choice of words, as if he'd read it before, as if he knew exactly where it came from. And that changed the way I looked at all of them. That sentence resonated with me, not just because of its content, but because of the timing. It was as if someone was testing my ability to connect loose ends, asking me, are you seeing what's in front of you, Spencer? It was the kind of clue you can't read, you can. And in the heavy silence of the house, each word seemed to echo through the rooms. Time there was speaking, and I began to listen. Some investigations are more moving than others. It doesn't happen often, but when it hits hard. That night, standing in front of the stopped clock, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a familiar chill, because that detail, time frozen at the exact moment of death, was nothing new to me. It happened to my father, the same pattern, the same silence, the same emptiness that doesn't scream, but consumes. My father died when I was 7. They said it was suicide, but there was a pocket watch in his hand, stopped at 4. And to this day, no one has been able to tell me how it happened. The forensic report was inconclusive, and the case was shelved. Since then, I've studied more than just crimes. I've studied patterns, and this one had all the signs that something deeper was at play. Returning to that kind of scene wasn't easy. The smell of old wood, the creaking of the floorboards, the way time seemed to slow down, everything took me back to that room, to that loss. But there, I couldn't falter. If there was one thing I'd learned, it's that the past exacts a heavy toll for every detour. And if this case had any connection to what happened to my father, I needed to see it through to the end. Maybe that's why I was more sensitive to details. Maybe that's why the clock spoke to me so much. It was as if it were saying, you know what's happening, you just don't want to accept it yet. The difference was that this time, I was in control. This time, I was the one asking the questions, and no matter how much the past was poking at my ribs, I knew this case went beyond the Ramirez house, much further. Investigating a crime is often like pulling the thread of a forgotten web, and the more I dug into Jonas's past, the more tangled, dirty, and uncomfortable it became. In 1998, he was responsible for one of the city's most controversial cases, the acquittal of Mauro Cassani, accused of murdering his wife and hiding the body. The evidence was clear, the motive obvious, but Jonas unraveled it all with surgical precision, and he won. What caught my attention was an obscure detail buried in the files. The clock at the crime scene had also been tampered with. Another Varden and Sons, curiously, stopped at 4. Same model, same time signature. Too much of a coincidence to ignore. I began to wonder if Jonas had known this at the time,
or if it was just another piece in the puzzle he himself had helped to put together. I looked up the name, Mauro Cassani. He'd died 3 years ago, apparently in a car accident, but his daughter Clara lived in the same city and worked as a restorer of ancient art. Guess which museum? Exactly. The one that recently received a generous donation from a foundation headed by Jonas. It was as if the past had found a way back, elegant, discreet, and lethal. That 1998 acquittal was what catapulted Jonas to the top, but perhaps it also sealed his fate. People like him think they control the game, but they forget that the board has memories, and that sometimes time doesn't erase anything, it only hides it until the right moment. And at that moment, I began to suspect that this crime wasn't just a settling of scores, it was a response, calculated, silent, and very personal. I returned to the clock. I needed more than just to look at it. I needed to understand. I opened the back compartment with a thin key, and began examining each gear. That's when I realized a small part was missing. The detent gear, responsible for maintaining the constant movement of the pendulum. Without it, the clock stops. Not breaks, just stops, the way it was found. The curious thing is that this piece doesn't fall out on its own. It doesn't come off over time. Someone had to remove it with a specific instrument, and someone who knew exactly which one to remove. I asked the expert about the level of expertise required to do this. The answer was straightforward. Only an experienced watchmaker could do it without damaging the system. And in the house, only one person had this level of familiarity with the mechanism, Herculano. I returned to his workshop under the pretense of a friendly conversation. As we spoke, I observed his tools, his gestures. Everything about him was precision, the kind of man who sees time as a living, breathing, and reactive body. I casually commented on the Ramirez model. He responded immediately. A rare model. Few know how to stop without leaving a trace. He didn't deny it, nor did he confirm it, but sometimes silence says more. On the way home, a thought kept running through my mind. What if the piece had been removed before the crime? What if the clock had been prepared days before, just waiting for the right moment to stop? That would change the time of the crime. It would change the alibi. It would change everything. And more than that, it showed that the killer didn't just want to kill, he wanted to control how time would be remembered. It was one of the most unlikely things I've ever found at a crime scene. When I examined the watch again, this time with more sensitive equipment, I heard a muffled sound coming from within the wood. It wasn't mechanical, it was digital. I carefully removed a small false base behind the dial, and found a hidden micro recorder. Small, discreet, with a slightly worn side button. It still had a battery. I took the device to the lab, and asked for complete discretion. When we heard its contents, the air in the room changed. The recording lasted 7 minutes. For the first few minutes, there was only silence, light footsteps, and the ticking of a clock. Then, a male voice, muffled, but audible. "Now time condemns you." The same phrase as the note. Then, the sound of something being dragged, and the metallic snap of a blade being opened. There was no sound of struggle, no screams, just more silence. And then the clock bell tolling at 2:30 a.m., exactly as reported by the resident. The microphone stopped picking up sounds the next minute, which reinforced the hypothesis that the recorder had been placed there on purpose, to capture that exact moment. It wasn't a mistake, it was a trap, and I'd been walking into it from the start. Someone wanted that recording discovered, not just to reinforce the timing, but to narrate a carefully planned execution, and perhaps to raise doubts. Was the person recording it in the room, or watching from afar? And why would someone use a clock as a speaker for death? I was no longer just looking at a killer, I was looking at a screenwriter, and this script apparently had even more twists in store. At first glance, the fireplace seemed like just another decorative detail, but something made me kneel there and look more closely. Among the cold embers, and the still fresh coals, were paper ash, recently burned. The texture was different, and the corners still bore small impressions. A symbol, partial letters, fragments of something someone didn't want read. I took the remains to the forensic lab, and asked them to do a nearly impossible job, try to reconstruct what was possible of the original document. A jigsaw puzzle, made of ashes, literally. After hours, we managed to recover parts of words. Testim klal, The structure pointed to a specific type of text, a will or legal addendum, and the conclusion was clear. Jonas tried to change something, and someone tried to erase it. Most of the papers in the house were intact, folders organized, old documents neatly filed, but that one was the only one that turned to ash. Why? Because it disturbed where it shouldn't have. Someone knew that if those contents came to light, they would lose everything, or reveal something they'd rather keep there. And the fireplace there was used not for warmth, but for silence. I had learned over the years that the loudest screams come from the things that try to keep quiet. And there, amidst the ashes, the fragments, and the deliberate silence, I realized the motive for the crime was beginning to take shape. But the curious thing is that the closer I got to the truth, the more it seemed to have been carefully redrawn, as if the killer was always one step ahead or one step to the side. Through unconventional means, I obtained access to the draft of Jonas's previous will. It stated everything would be divided between Helena and Tayo, a standard document, with no surprise, but an unregistered version, saved on an old flash drive in his personal safe, told a different story. Jonas intended to make a drastic change, transfer his entire inheritance to a newly created NGO. Guess who the president was? Dr. Luana. The shock wasn't just about the money, it was about the breaking of the family cycle, the silent betrayal it represented. Jonas was about to disinherit his own family in favor of a woman with whom he was possibly having a secret relationship, and more than that, a woman with access to his mind, his weaknesses, his fear. The connection between them ran deeper than anyone there wanted to admit. When I confronted Luana, she didn't deny it, nor did she confirm it. She simply said, Jonas wasn't the man he seemed. Cold, calculated words, but her eyes said something else. She knew this change in the will made her a target, or an accomplice, or both. And what's more, she knew Jonas wouldn't do it without telling Helena first, or threatening her with it. The line between power and revenge is thin, and inheritances have the power to reveal monsters that lurk behind well-dressed appearances. In the Ramirez household, everything was a facade, but all it took was an unsigned will, and a nearly finalized plan to awaken the most cruel within. And perhaps whoever killed Jonah didn't just want what he had, but rather to prevent what he was about to do. With the accumulated clues, I realized the crime revolved around a much more sophisticated concept: time manipulation, not in the metaphysical sense, but in the practical sense. The clock stopped at 2:43, led us to pinpoint the time of death, but the recorder hidden inside the piece revealed a different rhythm. The final sound of the recording occurred shortly after 2, and the forensic examiner, upon reviewing the rigor mortis, discovered a disturbing detail. The actual time of death was about an hour earlier than previously thought, around 1:48. This undermined carefully constructed alibis. Kayo, for example, claimed to have been listening to music since 2 a.m. Luana said she had left the house but with the new estimate, both would be cleared of the crime scene. And suddenly, the only person left without any plausible explanation was Helena. But there was more. The piece removed from the clock, the timed recording, the note left on the piano, everything pointed to someone wanting to create a scenario, a script. Not just kill Jonas, but control how his death would be interpreted, as if it were a spectacle. Time there was the main act. The clock, the setting, and we, the investigators, were just the audience watching a play disguised as a tragedy. Understanding the true time of death was like removing a blindfold. The investigation changed tone, color, and focus, and this led me to ask, who had enough control to manipulate the perception of time, and at the same time, emotional access to the victim, who knew the routine of the house, and knew that a minute's error would change the game. The answer was increasingly clear, and more dangerous. I called everyone into the room where Jonas was found. The idea was simple: replay the crime scene, with everyone present, and observe what emerged. The tension was palpable. Helena stood, arms crossed. Kayo slumped on the sofa board. Luana watched silently, her eyes fixed on the clock. And Herculano, he sat, exactly where Jonas had been, as if wanting to relive the scene from within. He didn't say a word, but he didn't blink either. I started again from the obvious, the time of death, the dismantled alibis, the tampered each element was presented as a piece of a puzzle that until then, everyone had pretended not to see. When I revealed the hidden engraving on the clock, I saw Luana's eyes widen. When I mentioned the removed piece, Helena took a step back. And when I mentioned the ashes of the will, Kaio swallowed hard. But Herculano, he smiled, as if knowing the final act had begun.
Little by little, the mask of neutrality crumbled. The clock didn't stop itself. Someone tempered with it. The burned will was the work of someone with access to the fireplace, and the engraving, placed by someone who knew that time in this case was more important than any knife. Herculano was the only one with the technical knowledge to stop the clock without breaking it, and the only one who didn't need to force entry. He was treated as part of the household. So I asked the question none of them expected. Why would you stop time, Herculano? And for the first time, he answered, because some things don't deserve to continue. The room fell silent. It wasn't just about Jonas. It was about something that had been going on for a long time. Something he'd been keeping hidden for years. The answer wasn't just logical, it was personal. And what he was about to reveal would change everything we thought we knew about that crime. What Herculano said next didn't feel like a statement. It felt like a letter held close to his heart, written with pent-up anger and aging pain. Jonas was going to tell Helena everything. He was going to say that Kaio wasn't his son, but mine. The revelation fell like a blade across the room. Kaio stood up, stunned. Helena paled. The silence was so thick that the imaginary ticking of a stopped clock seemed to echo in the air. That changed everything. According to Herculano, he and Helena had an affair over 20 years ago. Jonas knew, and used it to keep them both under control. For years, the watchmaker was forced to remain silent, watching his own son being raised by another man in another house. And when he learned that Jonas intended to reveal everything, as final revenge, something inside him broke. I didn't kill out of hatred, he said. I killed because Kaio didn't deserve to live knowing it was just a game. The weapon used was a rare razor, part of a collection kept in the home office. Herculano knew this. He knew where to find it, how to use it, and when to act. He planned everything down to the smallest detail, from the part removed from the watch to the exact moment of the recording. But he didn't run away. He didn't destroy evidence. He wanted the truth to come out at the right time. At the right time. Like the tolling of a bell that marks the end of a play. His arrest was silent. No resistance. No dramatic speech. Just an old man who had finally stopped running away from time. As he was led away, he gave me one last look. Not of guilt, but of relief. And I understood. This wasn't just an investigation. It was a reckoning between time, silence, and a man who just wanted to be heard before disappearing from the story he himself wrote. After everything, the house fell silent again, but not the dead silence of the first night. It was different. A silence that carries remnants of truth scattered throughout the rooms. The armchair was covered, the clock removed from the wall, and the fireplace, still there, waiting for another story. I walked through the house once more without questions, without a clipboard, just the weight of what never fit into the records. According to the official report, the case is closed. Herculano confessed, evidence was gathered, and the truth, at least the most visible, was recorded. But investigations like this don't end with a signature. They continue, echoing in gestures, in names, in silences. Because every crime has two versions, the one told and the one felt. And it was the latter that accompanied me to the door. I wondered how many stories were buried along with Jonas. How many decisions were made out of fear. How many silent truths shape entire families without anyone noticing. Time, in fact, doesn't erase things. It just pushes things to the back of the drawer. And sometimes, all it takes to bring everything to light is a clock that decides to stop. Since then, every time I hear the sound of a clock, I look twice. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because now I know that sometimes time doesn't mark the hour of death, but the hour of truth. What about you? Have you ever stopped to think about the moment in your life when time decided to freeze something you didn't yet have the courage to face? Some crimes leave their mark on the ground. Others leave their mark on time. The case of the stopped clock taught me that what kills isn't always the knife, the poison, or the plan. Sometimes, what truly destroys is what we hide. It's silence. Time doesn't erase anything, it archives it. And one day, inevitably, it will exact its toll. Jonas paid for past decisions, Herculano for a lifetime of omission. And me, I just did what I always do, listened to what no one else wanted to hear. Because in the end, that's what investigation is, giving voice to what no longer. And if there's one thing I learned from this case, it's that time doesn't stop by chance. It stops to reveal. Now think with me, is there some truth inside you that's stuck in time? Some internal clock frozen at a specific moment? Maybe today is the day to wind it up again, to re-listen to what you've been avoiding. Because ignoring time is dangerous. It always finds a way to get revenge. If this story made you think, if it touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's still a lot of investigation ahead, and the next case may be closer than you think.